iPods. I bought a few iPods back in my day, and we're just going to be identifying every single iPod that was ever made, ever, except for special editions, yes, the U2 and all that garbage. So we're starting with the iPod, the first ever iPod, this chunky boy. Now, there is an iPod first generation and iPod second generation, and the only difference is the click wheel. On the second generation, the click wheel is capacitive touch, right? So when you turn it and you spin it, it's your spinning your finger around a fixed circle, right? In the first generation, it was mechanical, which means the click wheel actually spun. It was a spinning piece of plastic, and you would spin it, normally. So that's the only difference between the first and second generation. They're both the same, and they charge off of Firewire. Firewire is essentially a beefed up cable that can revive dead iPods, and for these, it's the only way to charge them, right? Third generation, Apple went a little bit different, right? They had already went from using more mechanical things, to using more touch capacitive things, and for the buttons, they thought that's what was gonna, change next. So the buttons are up here rather than on the sides where they used to be, and of course, capacitive touch, standard, usual, right? These iPods can be kind of annoying to use. They look really cool, but they can just be really annoying a lot of times just to use. The capacitive touch gets older. They're not bad iPods, but they're not amazing either. They're very thick, and if you want to work on an iPod, I wouldn't suggest this just because the parts for it are very thin, because this is the only iPod besides the first and second gen without what I would call a modern click wheel, right? This has like the weird buttons and everything. It can be hard to find front cases just because, if they stuck with this design until 2007 when they got rid of the iPod altogether, then that would be easy to find parts for it. But they only made this style of iPod for like a year or so it's hard to find parts for it a lot of times. The fourth gen is kind of perfect. So this is, if you like older iPods, you're going to love the fourth gen. It has that typical, metal back, the grrr backing to it, which you would expect. And then it has this curved front piece of plastic. It has a gigantic drive. I believe the highest you could get was 80 gigabytes. And these were just amazing to use. They were great. This is like the classic iPod revamped. If you don't want, anything, you don't want any of the features, you don't want any of that, you just want an iPod, the fourth gen is definitely for you, right? The fifth gen and the 5.5 gen is kind of the same as the first gen and second gen. The fifth gen, although this time they correctly named it. The fifth gen, essentially, and the only difference between the fifth gen and the 5.5 gen is the search function. That's the only difference between the two. Also, don't fall for these scams. I know DangPod's made a video about it. There was also a U2 edition around this time. This is definitely my favorite iPod generation. So the difference between these and the fourth generation was these were video. This was the video iPod. Essentially, the screen changed, right? So this was the screen you would get before, this dot matrix like LCD display, right, with the backlight. This time you got an actual screen, like the one that you would see on your phone or computer. I believe it was an LCD too. Just a very, liquid crystal display. A very interesting thing, everything had fancy graphics, and this is where the iPod started to get, very interesting and very fun, with its technology and the way that things happened with it. It also, of course, had a capacitive touch click wheel, except this time, like the fourth generation, the buttons were in the click wheel, right? It wasn't just, like the click wheel, the buttons are around the click wheel, or the buttons are separated from the click wheel, like the third generation. The buttons were in the click wheel, so you could spin your finger around the click wheel if you wanted to, volume and stuff like that, or you could click down to, skip songs, play pause, and menu and stuff like that. So that was pretty much the only difference between the 5 gen and the 5.5 gen, the search function, right? That was pretty much it. The sixth generation was the last iPod. I believe that, the seventh generation, so Apple did this weird. The seventh generation is technically this same iPod, just with higher storage. It's a 160 gigabyte version, I believe, is the seventh generation. They just kept adding storage to it, and it's just the sixth generation. This is what you will get from 2007 on. Now, we can see this time it's metal unibody, during, especially the fourth gen, we had those iMacs. The iMacs, the white plastic 4G iMacs that, believe it or not, the iMac styles actually go with the iPod hand in hand, right? So the plastic iMacs went with the plastic iPods, right? The fifth gen, we got, the slicker one with the EyeSight camera, for the MacBooks. It's kind of like cars, how, like what's two cars that go together? Like the Tacoma and the 4Runner go together. That's kind of what this happens. The iPod goes with the iMac as, just the base ecosystem, right? So this is when the unibody iMacs came out. We also got the unibody this. I mean, they weren't bad. They're very rugged. They're a lot rugged than the other ones, just because the plastic display, they would scratch. You've seen them on DankPod's videos. These were also a lot thinner, depending on what, storage option you got. These, of course, also use 30-pin connectors. So that's pretty much it for the iPod Classic. They were good iPods, really. This was, again, very modern Apple. This wasn't like beginning where it was more of a computer, like a small computer. Now it's more of an actual handheld device. Of course, this is the 7th gen, just the same. There were minor, like, color changes and differences, like, in terms of color of click wheels and stuff and shades and all that. I believe the main difference was that the lettering on this one was black, and on the 7th gen it was white, I believe. There was some very not noticeable difference. If you need an iPod, these are great. I would definitely go for it. If you can afford one, I would personally just buy the 5th gen. It has all the features of the other one, and it just looks more like a classic iPod. So, yeah, that is it for the regular iPod. Moving on to the Mini. A lot of people wonder, and I'm definitely going to make a video about this sometime, I don't know when. A lot of people wonder why the Mini even existed, right? Just because, we had the Nano. Essentially, my thoughts is the technology to make the Nano didn't exist yet, so they needed a stopgap. Well, they were still working on the Nano. They just needed to shrink the iPod. They made this. It was fine. This is, of course, the iPod Mini. Now, there were only 2 generations and 1 body style, Technically, there was only 1 generation with mini changes, but, essentially the only difference between the 1st and 2nd generation from, physical differences, like you can see the difference, is the click wheels, right? On the 1st generations, the click wheels were gray, right? The lettering was gray. On the newer generation, the 2nd generation, which I believe came out in 2005, the lettering was the color of the iPod. So that's how you can kind of tell the difference. Other than that, the only real difference was you had gold instead of silver for the 1st generation, and then more vibrant colors for the 2nd generation. Other than that, that was pretty much it. There's not a whole lot of differences here. I actually have one. It's not bad. They're excellent iPads. Excellent iPods. I would get a regular iPod. 4 gigabytes, you can get that in a Nano. They have the physical hard drive. So, and these are not video/photo iPods. They just have this screen, this typical, like dot matrix LCD screen. So, yeah, they do have a backlight, but, that there's not a whole lot to say about them. They're great devices. If you want to use them, that's great, but Apple just made so many other iPods, these usually get overshadowed. These do have a lot more power than the Nanos, right? Because think of it like this. The Nanos was essentially just like an SSD with a battery and a screen. This was like a physical iPod, like a hard drive, which means you can, like, if you want a smaller iPod but you still want to mod it, the Mini's for you. You can change the click wheel. It doesn't have the same customability of the iPod where you can change the front and back case. It's just one solid sheet of metal, and they're a lot harder to open than the regular iPod. But if you want to, I don't know, put Wikipedia, oh, that's a good idea. Someone should do that. If you want to put Wikipedia or something on these will handle a lot more abuse and a lot more modding than the Nanos are, just because the Nanos are kind of frail and fragile, So that was pretty much, I love the funky gold. So that was pretty much the entire Mini. Moving on to the Nano generation of the iPod Nano. They came in black and white. They had the standard click wheel, a small little screen, although this was like the photo screen. It never got an LCD because remember, the Mini was kind of the old school one. Imagine this is like the regular classic going into 4 from 5, right? The iPod Mini was the iPod Classic from 0 to 4. This is 5 and onward, right? So it had that color screen, wasn't bad. These were actually great. We have to talk about the black spot. Come on, it's a Mini. Essentially, the batteries are very, 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 very small, and they have a very small amount of room, right? This is why we see this in Chromebooks. They expand, and on this model, remember, this is actually what I would say the less dangerous of all of these, and you'll see why in a minute. Because the way these are constructed, they have a plastic front that's laid on top of a metal back. More like an actual iPod, right? Imagine this like a tiny little envelope of electronics. So if the battery popped, you could, in theory, if you had a lot of soldering equipment and all that, change it yourself and it would be easier, right? The batteries do push up on these. I don't think it's worth it. You can have one of these. I would take the battery out of it, maybe put it on display. But other than that, it's not really worth it to go through all of this, all the lengths, right, to change the battery and do all that stuff. And if you do have an issue, see, the reason why these ones are recalled and the other ones aren't so much is because these actually burst into flames. The other ones just kind of get black spots and stuff until it eventually bursts. This one, because it's so bundled up in there, tends to burst a lot quicker, right? There's no tolerance, right? Because remember, the single sheet of acrylic, I believe, is also holding the screen down. So the other ones, the screen can actually pop up and out if the battery starts to swell in your closet or anything. With this, there's no tolerance, and it'll just, right, if it keeps trying to expand. The second generation, Apple was trying something different. So they took the regular iPod, Nano, and they made it colorful, and they gave it this. This is where the issues start. This is the worst iPod Nano, for battery issues, at least. Essentially, instead of being plastic, it's all metal, which means if that battery starts to swell, yes, it can push the screen out, but you're not getting it out, right? At least with this one, you could pry up the screen and get to the battery. With this one, that's almost impossible. You have to slide all the guts out, push in the click wheel, push in everything. You actually have to push in the screen to slide everything out. It's impossible to change the batteries once it swells. And even if it hasn't swelled, it's still a very hard job. Again, these just aren't worth it, right? If you want to listen to music, they're just not worth it to change the battery, to get a soldering iron, to do all that stuff just to change the battery. So whenever I get one of these, I, take the battery out if I can, or just throw it away, That's just the unfortunate reality. The best generation was the third generation. Why? Well, again, remember, this is going back to what I would call the unibody construction. With the face, right, it has a face, and then it has that back metal plate, which means you can pry up the face from the metal back and take out the battery and replace it. So that's a lot easier than the other iPod models. They also just came in great colors. I personally love the green in that one. The red was okay. These weren't bad, actually. If you're looking for an iPod Nano, I would definitely get this one. These also had this screen, which means you could play videos on it, which means it was great. Video, it's amazing. You can do stuff. Remember, the Nanos, like I said, they're just an SSD with a screen and a click wheel and a battery, maybe sometimes if it hasn't exploded yet. So you can't mod these, right? Maybe you can change the front or back case. You can't put Bluetooth. There's no wiggle room in that. Every single inch is filled, right? When Steve Jobs took that original iPod and dunked it in the water and saw bubbles come up, you betcha he did it with these. And let me tell you, no bubbles came out of these ones. The fourth generation was fun because of all the colors. My personal goal is to get this generation and buy all the colors and take all the batteries out and just display them. These were fun, right? These were very fun, but they still had battery issues. They had very bad battery issues. These were they weren't bad. They had small screens. They were technically video screens if you held them sideways like this. So, was it a bad iPod? No, but the battery issues are what really makes this an issue. And you can tell they were more ovular than the regular size ones. The fifth generation, these kind of sucked a lot. This is where, in my opinion, the iPod Nano went from being like an iPod to Apple cash grab. Was it bad? No. In fact, it was shiny, and I'd love to have every single color of these. That orange and that yellow, that blue and that green, that pink. I want those. I want this. I would leave out that, but I just want the colorful ones. These were neat. Again, these could play videos sideways if you wanted to. These had a camera. The camera stunk. The camera really stunk. It stunk, right? You didn't want this. The camera stunk. And that's just how that went. These have the battery issues as well. Remember, it's still got the metal unibody. Even though it's got a bigger screen, you still have to slide everything out, which makes it a pain in the butt to replace anything. And the ovular, it's like an oval. It just makes it worse to hold. The sixth generation was probably, the third generation is the best generation. The sixth generation is the next best generation if you want to use it, The third gen is if you want to use it. This one's if you want to have it on display or anything. This one doesn't have a click wheel, but it is still nice to use. It's got very interesting colors. I personally really like the yellow. You can wear it as a watch if you wanted to. This was kind of like the Apple Watch. There it is. Like the first ever quote-unquote Apple Watch. I was actually happy with this, with the watch band. I remember I had one with a watch band, and it was very nice, actually. Listening to radio on your watch, checking the time. It did everything you needed it to. These were great. Remember, these are more of a watch than really an iPod, but still, these were still amazing. Tolerances, again, these don't really have battery issues, These are kind of the freaks. And then we have the 7th and 8th generations. The 7th gen was fun to look at with all the colors. I would also love to have all these colors. And then the 8th generation was kind of, it wasn't, the colors were awful. it was not amazing, great to use, and you couldn't wear it as a watch, which means, the lack of the click wheel. Like, the click wheel was amazing to use. So, with it being gone for this, I was still kind of sour about that, but it made sense because it was so small and light and nice and portable. This isn't portable, it's not nice, and it doesn't have a click wheel. This is probably my least favorite generation, just because, like, the 8th generation, because it doesn't have any fun colors, which is what the entire point of the Nano was, right? And it's just kind of meh. Now, these are the best to use. They work with AirPod Pros, Bluetooth, all that. But still, I don't know, I'm kind of sour. So, yeah, that's pretty much the iPod Nano for you, all wrapped up. Tastiest of the iPods, the iPod Soufflé. Now, the original first generation Shuffle, you could wear it as a lanyard. It had a mini click wheel. You couldn't spin it because there was no screen or anything. These worked great. They were only 1 gigabyte, so it's not like you're going to put entire folders on these if you need to, use them as like a poor man's SD card or anything like that. These are holding singular files. It wasn't bad for music if you needed to use these for music, but remember, these weren't like be all end all. These were just great just to have, if you didn't care if it broke or anything, especially nowadays. Modding, they're okay. The iPod Shuffle is essentially just an SD card with a battery. That's it. And a D-pad. That's it. That's all there is. No screen. Very basic. Anyway, yeah, no 30-pin connector either, just USB. And these actually weren't bad. You had the headphones coming out the top. Not bad. Actually, pretty good. The second generation is when they tried to do like this format, so you could actually have something to grab onto. It clipped onto things. These weren't bad. They had little docks. I always love Apple's docks. They're always so amazing. These are great. If you can find one of these second generations, it'll be great. They last forever, and you have something to grip onto, as later generations didn't. Then they experimented with this type, which is like bigger clip weird thing. They're very difficult to do anything with, and yes, you can disassemble them. They're not bad. If you can find one used, they're great, if you need them for anything. I would say they're a little bit harder to use than the first and second generations, just because of, a lack of anything, really. They're just a metal coupling that plays songs. That's all it is. There's nothing else to say. Again, very simple device. These last forever because there's really nothing in them, just a tiny little battery. And then the 4th generation, these were made from about like 2011 to 2015. There's nothing to grab onto here. These are better. With this, you just chose, if it shuffled it, if it repeated it, or if it did what, and that was the only means of communication. This, you can turn the volume up, turn the volume down, because remember, a lot of the controls from these came from the earbuds that were plugged into them. These actually had something resembling a quick click wheel, and if you just need, I would definitely buy the second generation. Yes, they hold less, but you have something to grip onto when you're holding it. These, they just get lost, So, if you're looking for one of these, the Shuffle might be for you. They're not bad. Especially this generation. This is the newest one. It's not going to have Bluetooth or anything crazy like that, but, not bad. On to our next extravaganza, which is the iPod Touch, which is unfortunately the last iPod on this list. For the beloved iPod Touch. The first generation came out with the iPhone and essentially was an iPhone without the phone. You may notice that this bit was shoved off all the way in the corner. I believe it's very hard to find an actual first generation. Yeah, it was cut off like this. That was where the antennas were for stuff. I believe Wi-Fi. I believe it had Wi-Fi. Of course, you've got the iconic Macy Gray. I don't think I've ever seen an advert that wasn't with Macy Gray on the front of it. That's just what it launched with. That's what the box had on it. That was just, that's just how it was. These were pretty good. For usability, they stink. They're not bad, but remember, this is like first generation iPhone territory. Are they bad? No, they're fine. I just would recommend getting something newer, especially when they're so cheap, right? These are nice to have around, but the only reason why you would get these over another model is just the gloriousness of it being a first generation of something. The second generation, instead of having that little cutoff bit, it actually had a circle around there, and it was more, ovular shaped. Other than that, it was the same. This is just what it looked like. It was fine. You could play digital poker or whatever. Not bad. No front camera, no rear camera, just standard. This was just what you got, and, it wasn't bad. People didn't complain. I still have friends that still are rocking around with these, right? The third generation, again, they stayed the same for like 3 generations with minor changes. No front camera, no rear camera, just iPod, right? This is, again, an iPod. The only purpose of this is to be an iPod. This isn't an iPhone. It doesn't have a camera. No, this is just an iPod with a screen. That's the way it should have been. And then as soon as they gave it a screen, that's when it started to die. The fourth generation was when they decided, you want to know what? We could make it just like an iPhone. And they gave it a front rear camera. The cameras, were they bad? No. Were they great? No. They were just okay. The cameras were mediocre. These held up really well. Of course, they have the iPod, standard silverback. Yeah, these. These are, if you have a toddler, I remember, especially when I was growing up, if you had any grubby toddler sitting in a shopping cart at a department store or anything, they had one of these, and they still do, with the Cheeto dust fingers. This is the official iPod of Cheeto dust finger. Kids, don't want to buy your kid an iPhone, buy them an iPod Touch. This was the first time that actually happened. And of course, they were marketing it to kids, well, at least their parents. Apple cared about it. This is just what happens. Apple, oftentimes you can tell if they either care or don't care about it, because when they don't care about it, they're not going to update it. They're just going to keep it looking the same forever until they finally change it a little bit. With the 5th generation, Apple said, hey, god dang it, we can make some money with this. They decided to change it. Front rear cameras. I had one of these. I loved it. Lasted forever until I broke it and lost it. And these were just so amazing. They were great devices. You had, you could plug in headphones. They had the lanyard. They were just so cool. They were exactly like an iPhone. Oh, so weird. Did they have ones without cameras? Ugh. They had ones without cameras. I'm sure they didn't, but that looks awful. Awful that looks. Anyway, no, go back. Go back. Why does it really all of a sudden just love to do the image search? No. It loves to do the image search so much. Hey, look, it's a listing. Fun. That's really fun. Amazing. Yeah. They're not bad. If you want to buy one of these, they're great. And then with the 6th generation, Apple stopped caring again. They just gave it the colors of the iPod and removed the lanyard. DangPods has got a silver one. A gold one. That's it. This is how the iPod died. Apple 2019, they just said, well, it's not really selling. We're really tired of it. We don't have to update it. So, burn forever. That's kind of how these ended. It's sad to see it end that way, but, it's Apple. Anyway, yeah, that's pretty much this video. This is all the iPods that have ever been made that you can ever buy, excluding generations and weird overseas models. With that, thank you for watching. Don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe, and I will see us all next time.